In this video, we're going to show you how to install the starter on your Cadillac Escalade located on the lower passenger side of the engine. You want to go ahead and open up the hood, locate the battery, which is on the passenger back side of the engine bay, and we want to disconnect the ground terminal on the battery using a 10mm socket extension. And just go ahead and loosen this here. Then we want to reach in there, grab that terminal and that harness and just kind of wiggle that and disconnect the ground terminal on the battery. Now sometimes if you can't get that battery terminal off, it is going to be easier to go ahead and remove this bracket. There are 4 14mm bolts. Go ahead, loosen and remove those. With that bracket out, you can then go ahead and reach right down, grab that, pull right up on that terminal. Now we're just going to tuck that aside. I'm just going to secure it underneath that harness. Now in order to locate the starter, you're going to be up underneath the passenger side of the engine in front of the sway bar. And the cylinder right here is the starter. It's going to be bolted to the block. And then we have our transmission right here, so you can go ahead and locate that unit. Now there are 2 13mm nuts on the back side here holding the starter up into place. On the front side of the starter is going to be 2 wiring harnesses we need to disconnect. We're going to try and get to those harnesses after we unbolt the starter and lower it down a little. Use a 13mm socket with an extension. I chose to use a breaker bar. Get some good leverage on that. And then once it's broken free, you can switch over to some faster equipment and zip those out. Always good to be wearing eye protection, as debris can be falling down in your face. You don't want anything in your eyes. I'm going to reach up and hold that starter. Both bolts are the same length, so it doesn't matter what position they go into. You can reach up. I'm going to pull that starter towards the front of the engine, separating the gear drive unit. As you go to pull the starter out, there's a portion right here that comes in contact with the side of the engine. There's a piece of the metal right there. So you can't pull it straight out. You're gonna have to reach up and kind of grab that starter and kind of wiggle it off to the side and pull it out like so. Now sometimes you can pull on the harness a little bit and you get a little bit of flexibility. And that's what we're gonna try and do here. Ideally, you want to drop it down and then get access to the hardware or the wiring harness. Make it a little bit easier that way there. Now, if you tilt that starter, bring that nose of it down, you should be able to slide this back a little bit. With the starter tilted back, there is a shield here that is just clipped on to the starter solenoid. It's just kind of a spring load tension type of thing that pops onto place. Go ahead and set that aside. One of the harnesses we need to disconnect has a foil wrap on. It's a high temp wrap, and it goes up to an electrical connector up top. We need to disconnect that, as well as the power cable going to the starter itself. They're up on top. You're going to be doing a little bit of blind work, but you want to feel up there and disconnect the connectors, and we'll remove the nut for the battery cable up there. So let's go ahead and get to it. Now we rotated the starter so that our solenoid here was off to the right of the transmission. And we just kind of pull this down a little bit, like so. Now with the starter tilted down, we were able to rotate a little bit. And we have a connector in the back. It's tan with the green, and the tan part has a little retaining clip on it. So I'm gonna use a 90-degree pick. If you have small hands, you can kind of snake it up inside here. It's a little bit tough to get to, but I'm gonna put this up there and I'm going to rotate that tab. Here we go. I was able to disconnect that. So here is that unit. I just used the pick to undo this little tab right here and gently lift up, and it popped right out. So I'm gonna tuck that back up and out of the way. And if I rotate the starter a little bit, it's gonna give us access to the battery cable. It goes to a nut right on the back side there. So that is our next component we need to disconnect. Using a 13mm socket on my 1/4" stubby ratchet, I'm gonna reach up there, do a little pretzel action with my arm, and try and get on that nut there. Good, break that nut free. We'll spin that off. And then once it's loose, technically you should be able to reach up there and spin it off with your fingers. It's a little bit challenging to get up there. Remove that nut. And then once you undo that wire, the starter almost drops down. Go ahead and position this here. You're gonna flex these transmission lines just a little bit, not too much, but just enough to try and finagle this out, and there you have it. Now the reason why we're replacing a starter is that we had an intermittent start issue, and then we removed it. We actually found that the starter solenoid ceramic here, the plastic, was broken. You can see that exposes the elements right inside there. This could have been somehow part of the issue with moisture and stuff getting inside, causing a problem with our starter solenoid. Now we have our two starters here, new one on the left, old on the right. Now we have the updated version on the left-hand side, and what this does is on this side here is a nut where you're gonna have to use an eyelet to install onto this. Whereas the old one had that big connector that we had to use our pick to pop off of. So if you happen to get the updated version, you're gonna need to acquire a lug, strip the wire, and install that. Now if you're gonna be installing the lug, you wanna cut this wire right at the back of the connector. Next, use the appropriate wire stripper to go ahead and strip this back. You don't have to strip too much of that sheathing off, like so. Now ideally, you want some heat shrink tubing. You want to slide that up and over. In our particular case, we're going to have to peel back some of this wrap here. We just want to make some room for that heat shrink tubing to wrap up so we can make sure that that adheres properly and seals it up nice. What we're trying to do is prevent water, moisture, stuff from getting into our connection. Take your time, make sure the job is done nice and neat. Go ahead and take your eyelet, slide that over. And then we'll go ahead and crimp this. Give that a tug, make sure it's nice and secured. We're going to slide our heat shrink tubing over, just like so. Now you can normally use a lighter or something like that, but you want a heat source to go ahead and shrink down that tubing there. And just heat that up so that it shrinks down around it. And then we'll let it cool. Now on the new starter here, you want to go ahead and remove this nut and washer. Now this is an 8mm, so when you go to install, you want to make sure you have your 8mm. Remove that, and then there's a lock washer. Make sure you remove that. Set that aside. And then we have our 13mm here for a battery power cable, and we're going to loosen and remove that. And set that aside. Once we have the nut off, grab the lock washer on that stud as well. Set that aside. Go ahead and line up the starter. Make sure that the solenoid is on the top. You're going to snake that in. Might have to pull down on these transmission lines just a little bit, just to snake that up in there. Now with that set up there, let's go ahead and install our wires. Then we have our eyelet here, and that's going to go onto that single post, and then we have our battery cable that needs to go on the terminal on the lower left. I'm just going to try and push this up into place a little bit, tilt it, maneuver it around, and do what I got to do to get my hand up in there to get those wires installed. Now what I'm doing now is I'm putting the snout of the starter, I'm going to try and put it up and into place, or at least close to it. So I can get my hand up and around and get those wires installed. Okay, I have the single modified wire on there. And for this portion, I need to remove my gloves because there is no way you can handle this tiny little lock washer. No way you can handle that little lock washer and put that on that stud. Let's go ahead and get that nut started on there. Now remember, that is an 8mm. Once you get that started on there, we can go ahead and put our stubby ratchet up in there and we'll snug that down. We're now going to install the battery cable, the thicker one. Install the lock washer. And then the nut. One of the key things for the battery cable here is that there's a little tab on this right here, and it actually goes into a tab on the starter, on the solenoid itself. So you have to make sure that that wire and that tab slip in there when you tighten this here, and that locks it into place. This time here, what I'm going to do is use a long 1/4" extension, swivel, and my 13, and I'm going to go over the axle or the drive shaft area here, go up and over onto the nut for the battery. And I'm going to go ahead and start to tighten this, but I also have to guide that tab in. So you just want to make sure that's good and tight, and you can see the tab is right in that groove. Let's go ahead and grab that 8mm, and we'll do the same for the upper nut there. We'll go ahead and secure that. There we go, make sure that's good and tight. Before we install the 2 bolts for the starter, let's go ahead and install our heat shield onto the starter solenoid. You're going to reach us up over the top here and press these tabs over the solenoid. With that clipped on, let's go ahead and line up the starter and get our bolts in. You might have to wiggle that starter around just a little bit. Go ahead and get that bolt started. I'm going to thread it in, make sure I get several threads in on that bolt. That's going to allow me to release that. With both of them started, snug them down. Now the nut here for the battery cable on the starter solenoid, if you have the ability to do so, you want to torque this to 44 inch-pounds. Torque down the starter bolts to 37 foot-pounds. Install the ground terminal on your battery. Push that down. Let's snug down the clamp. You want to make sure that that's good and snug, but you don't want to over tighten it. So make sure that's good. Go ahead and grab that terminal, give it a wiggle, make sure it doesn't spin. Install your bracket if you did remove it. Get your bolts started. Once we get them all started, we'll go ahead and snug them down. Perfect. All the washers line up with the old dirt rings on there. Beautiful. Bracket secured. And you're all set.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.